What's up? Jeff from RetroArcadeGaming.com. That's all one word. And it's time for another edition of Battle of the Ports. In this series, we take a look at a specific classic arcade game and see how well or poorly it's been ported to various console and computer systems over the years. Up this week, the groundbreaking driving game. Not a racing game, driving game. Released by Sega in 1986. OutRun. OutRun was groundbreaking in a number of ways. First, it allowed the player to select one of 3 songs to have playing as they drove. First game ever to allow you to pick your music that you wanted to have playing while you drove. Of course, it was their music, but you could pick it, and that was unbelievable at the time. Second, it was the first driving game, racing game, whatever you want to call it, to offer force feedback through the steering. And the deluxe sit-down cockpit module offered hydraulics that moved the seat as the car moved, the road bounced, whatever. First game to do that, something we expect every driving racing game to do today. Obviously, we can't replicate that on the old consoles or computer systems, but OutRun was the first to do it. Finally, and this really isn't groundbreaking, but I'm going to say that from an arcade standpoint, OutRun was the first public safety announcement for seatbelt use. When you crash at a high enough speed, you and your blonde passenger both get violently ejected from the flipping vehicle. Yep, the vehicle flips. That's something we're going to look at in the ports. I don't know why, but it's an important version of part of the game for me, is how well do the games replicate that flipping and the throwing of the passengers? Because it just seems like part of OutRun that should be there. So we're going to look at that and see how well they replicate it, if at all. It's hard to play racing driving games on consoles and computers without a steering wheel when they were designed for a steering wheel and a gas pedal and gear shift and what have you. We're going to attempt to do that. Most of these games were designed to allow you to do that. I'm just not a big fan of it, and that's basically my cop-out for saying I suck at racing games. So, with that, here's about 30 seconds of the arcade version of OutRun without me flapping my mouth. Okay, maybe closer to a minute. OutRun. Up first, we're going to take a look at the MS-DOS port, which was released by Sega and Unlimited Software in 1989. Graphically, for a 16-color MS-DOS game, this is actually pretty good. It's not bad by any means. We've looked at some pretty crappy DOS ports. I don't think this is one of them. This one's pretty decent. It does a decent job of replicating the original gameplay, with some minor differences. The graphics are a bit pixelated, obviously. It's MS-DOS game. But it does capture a sense of speed that some of the other ports are going to be missing. The trackside elements are sparse, completely different, or missing in some areas. It does maintain what I like to call the non-linear gameplay by allowing you to choose your path at certain times. There's points in the original OutRun arcade game where you can go left or you can go right. And the MS-DOS port allows you to do that. A lot of the ports are not going to allow that. It does attempt to replicate the car flip. It's not real spectacular. The car flips, but the passengers can just kind of show up on the corner of the screen. So they don't really get ejected, which is kind of disappointing. But it is what it is. The biggest complaint, obviously, is the same as with all MS-DOS games that were released pre-sound card, and that's the sound coming from the PC speaker. You can see as we fired this thing up, we had all three musical selections to choose from. But really, that's about the only good thing you can say about the sound on this. There's no sound effects other than the music playing poorly through the PC speaker. Go ahead, take a listen for yourself and look at the game before we move on to the next port. So up next, we're going to look at the Sinclair Spectrum port, which was released by US Gold and Probe Software in 1987. And as usual, this one will take me a few moments to get configured. So hang on for a second while I configure up the controls and start the game. So, after looking at a few titles for the Spectrum, I've obviously come to expect very little in the graphics department. It's just kind of the way it is. And on its surface, this one Seems to be another crappy Spectrum port. It's got the whole monochrome color scheme going on, which is somewhat off-putting, but actually the details aren't that bad. Again, it's a limitation of the system and kind of the trade-off for what they call the color clash, which is either a lot of colors and no detail, or a lot of detail and no color. This one gave you some pretty good detail, but not a whole lot of color. It only plays 2 of the 3 soundtracks from the original game, and there's no way to select what plays. Basically, they alternate as you progress through the various stages. Speaking of stages, all of the branching paths are present. But the problem is it's a multi-loader, so the game stops and loads the next stage before proceeding. It's kind of a buzzkill. You're going 200 kilometers per hour or miles per hour or whatever the hell it is, and suddenly the game just stops and you gotta wait. And then when the game starts up again, you're going 200 kilometers, 200 miles per hour again. Fortunately, from what I've read, depending on the path you take, it only needs to do this once. If you take the same path the next time you play it, it won't have to load those stages up again. So, I guess you can play the game over and over and over again and never take a different path, and you could get rid of that pesky loading of stages. You and your passenger are actually relatively safe in this one, as no one gets ejected, and the car doesn't actually flip. It just kind of spins out of control and then stops. But what really kills this game is the frame rate. There's actually no sense of speed, and it actually makes the car almost impossible to control. For a Spectrum title, it looks okay, it sounds okay, the game unfortunately is garbage. Take a look and listen for yourself. Up next, we're going to take a look at the Commodore 64 title, released by US Gold in 1987. And this one will take a moment to load up, so bear with me. So by Commodore 64 standards, this is not really a very good port at all. For starters, as you saw in the last screen, there's no on-the-fly route decisions to be made, so you can't selectively choose the left or the right fork. You have to select the route you want to take before actually stepping into the car. Fortunately, you can select your music, and the radio in its crude stage is back, and it sounds pretty good. Only 2 of the original 3 music selections are available. And outside of the music, that's probably about the only good thing about this. The sound effects are weak, lacking. Graphically, it's just all wrong, or at least it feels wrong. The color palette is a mess. Trackside elements, again, sparse or missing. Specifically, when you pass a truck, those things are pathetic. They did attempt to make the car kind of half-assed flip, as it flips kind of away from you on the screen, shows the bottom of the car, but it doesn't really flip over and over and over again, and nobody really goes flying. I don't know why that's important to me, but it is. It's maybe the one thing I remember from the original arcade game. I don't know. This is a disappointing port, a poor effort overall, and I'm going to let you enjoy the only redeeming quality of this port, the music, before we move on to our next port. Up next is a system we haven't really looked at before, which is the Microsoft MSX2. The MSX2 and its predecessor, the MSX, were primarily released in Japan, and the MSX2 was released in 1985. I believe the original MSX was released in 1983. This was released by Port Canyon in 1988. The music is selectable. All 3 songs are present. It's decent, but it's got a bit of an electronic sound to it that I don't really like or care for. The sound effects themselves are subpar, have a tendency, specifically the tire squealing sound, to cut out the music in the background. The trackside elements, pretty sparse. The car does flip, depending on the impact, obviously, but nobody gets ejected. It does offer the on-the-fly decision-making as far as which route you want to take, left or right, which is nice. We've seen a couple titles now that haven't offered that, so to see that back again is pretty nice. And I'll let you take a look at the sights and sounds of OutRun on the MSX2. So up next, we're going to look at the Amiga port of OutRun. And this one does take a bit of time to load up, so bear with me. And when you see the title screen, don't get too excited, because there's still a bit of a wait. I also intended to review the Atari ST port, but I don't know if I got a bad copy of it or what the deal is with it, but I couldn't get it to play properly. It loads up, I can start the game, but there's the car doesn't ever show up. So it's like you're driving from this bumper cam type of deal, and it plays at like warp speed. So it's useless. I tried a couple other ports of it. I just couldn't get it to work. But
Sega
the ST and the Amiga ports are almost identical with only minor differences. Both were released by US Gold. The ST port in '88 and the Amiga port in '89. They both have a dumb, goofy voiceover when they start up. I'm not sure whose idea that was and why they thought it was a good idea. But I can only hope that person was never allowed to make a decision on another game again in their life. All kidding aside. We'll wait for this to finish loading up, and then we'll get into it. Alright. So, this one has a menu system where you can select not only your controller, but the music track. There's no radio, so to speak. There's the menu selection of what music track you want to play. And you can also select the traffic level. Going back to the music, you only have 2 of the 3 original tracks available to you. It does have some issues with sprite placement. The camera viewpoint, probably too far down. But it does play fluidly without a whole lot of issue. The music is well done, but the sound effects pretty poor, almost non-existent. There's no branching paths, so you get the route that's presented to you with no option to customize or change it. Again, the biggest drawback going back to the Sinclair Spectrum, it's a multi-load game. So when you reach a checkpoint, the game stops, pauses, waits for the next stage to load up, and then continues. Mentally, I just don't like that. It's a momentum killer, and it really sucks. So enjoy the sights and sounds and my poor driving skills on the Amiga port of OutRun. So from the Amiga, we're going to jump into the console realm, where we're going to start with the Sega Master System port, released by Sega themselves in 1987. This is actually a pretty good port from I don't know how you say it, from a Master System point of view. First things first, the stereo is back, so we can select from all three of the original songs, and they don't sound half bad, considering sound was never really a strong point of the Master System. The sound effects themselves are fair, and fortunately, other than tire squeal, you don't really hear them too much. Graphically, it looks like OutRun without a whole lot of bells and whistles. There's not a whole lot of trackside detail, and that's okay because it actually keeps the game running pretty smoothly. A bit of flicker, but it's not overly distracting. The car does flip when you crash, but again, nobody disappointingly gets ejected. The branchable routes are present, so you can choose left or right. No annoying load times on those choices. My only really complaint with this port is that there's some choppiness in the car control. And it's not quite as responsive as it should be. Overall, it's not a bad port that portrays a sense of speed well, but forgoes a lot of the detail in order to do so. So take a look at the Master System port of OutRun. From the Master System, let's move on to the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive port. Again, released directly by Sega in 1991. And I gotta admit, I kind of like this one. It's pretty good. All the original music is present. and it sounds pretty good. It does have, I like to call it the typical Genesis electro or electronic sound to it, but it's not really distracting. Just unique. Graphically, it recreates the arcade version pretty faithfully, at least as faithfully as it can. All the gameplay elements, from the car flipping to the you and your hot blonde getting thrown, are present. There's a lot more detail than the Master System port, a lot more trackside detail. The gameplay does get a bit choppy at times, but it's manageable and not too much of a distraction. Overall, this is a pretty good port and probably the best we've looked at so far. Take a look and listen for yourself.
Checkpoint.
From the Genesis, let's jump into the NEC Turbo Graphics port, which was released by NEC themselves in 1990. This is also a pretty decent port. Got a couple of faults that knock it down just a bit in my book. We'll get into it here. You'll see, for starters, the color palette, specifically the blue, is way off. Everything looks a bit muted and dull. To make I'm gonna make an analogy here. The Genesis version looks like it was painted with high gloss paint, and this looks like it was painted with watercolors. Other than that, the graphics might be a bit cleaner than the Genesis version. The music is pretty good, sounds just a bit thin, and finally the car does flip, but nobody gets ejected. I'd probably give an edge to the Genesis port, but this one holds its own. It's pretty well done. With the exception of the color palette, it's fairly faithful to the original arcade version. You can see for yourself as I back out. So our last console version is the Sega Saturn version. And quite frankly, it doesn't get any better than this one. This was released in 1987 as part of the Sega Ages collection, developed by M2. The Ages collection was a re-release of classic Sega video games, basically at budget prices. In Japan, it was usually one title per release, but in the US and Europe, we often got multiple titles. So, OutRun was released individually in Japan, but in the US and Europe, it was bundled as a compilation with Space Harrier and I believe Afterburner 2, I don't remember which. It's pretty much a spot-on recreation of the arcade version, with the added bonus being the ability to select a difficulty level, which essentially changes the traffic density. This one speaks for itself. I'll let you clearly see that as you watch Sega Saturn port come out.
Checkpoint.
I let that one go a little long as it's just that darn good. Next, we're going to take a look at OutRun on two handheld devices, starting with the Sega Game Gear. This was released by Sega in 1991, and it's a whole port of a port thing. This was basically a port of the Master System release with some minor differences. You select your music from the main menu, but all three songs are present, and it does look almost identical to the Master System version, and lacks a lot of the details from the original arcade version. Trackside elements, minimal. Traffic, minimal. Never more than 2 lanes of traffic, which is the real drawback for me. The music is decent. Probably the best part of this game. No real sense of speed. Frame rate's really poor. Timing is off as well. This one's hard to explain, but it seems like I drive forever before I get to a checkpoint. There's something weird in the timing that is just off in this game. The car does flip. No passenger ejection. Go ahead, take a look and listen for yourself and see how you like the Game Gear version of OutRun. Finally, the OutRun port on the Game Boy Advance, released by THQ in 2003 on the Sega Arcade Gallery title, which was OutRun, Afterburner, Space Harrier, and Super Hang-On. I gotta admit, man, the Game Boy Advance was pretty badass. And this port's pretty impressive, and it's a whole lot of fun to play. It has all the elements of the original arcade game. It looks good, it sounds good. Get ready. It's just fun to play. They did a good job on this. And the Game Boy Advance, if you're not familiar with it, it's got some pretty badass titles for a little handheld system. So, with that, I'm going to shut up, and I will let you judge for yourself the gameplay of OutRun on the Game Boy Advance. So with that, we're done with our look at the ports of the classic arcade game OutRun. For me, actually, this one was pretty interesting study in how advanced the arcade games were at the time of the release, and how the home market progressed from the somewhat crappy Sinclair Spectrum port to the Sega Saturn port. It's amazing to see the advances over what's relatively a short period of time. With that, here's my recommendations based on the titles, and only the titles we looked at today. If you want to play OutRun on the go, fire up the Game Boy Advance and get to drive. Now, I said we're only going to talk about the titles I reviewed today, but the 3DS version is pretty fantastic as well. But we didn't look at that today, did we? The Sega Saturn is the clear winner on the console side of things, with the Genesis port, in my opinion, a distant second. I know that the Genesis port has its fair share of detractors, but there's so many bad ports we've looked at that it actually looks and plays well in comparison. Of the computer ports, I really don't have a favorite. They're all pretty poor. It's hard to pick one, but if I had to, I'd probably play the MS-DOS version, just for its attempt to maintain some faithfulness to the original arcade game. I'm not sure how many times you'll hear me actually say to play the MS-DOS version, but I'm doing it in this case. Just make sure you turn off the speaker while you're playing it. And then play it without any sound, and you're good to go. With that, I'm done. I'm out. We'll see you next time. Until then, happy gaming. Peace.